Welcome back, guys. In these crazy times, I hope you're all doing well. I'm not going to dwell on the current situation because we've got music to make. This is part 3 of a 4-part series focusing on EQ, what it is, why we need it, and how best to use it. Part 1, link in the description below, was covering the basics just to get you involved in it and get you started with EQ. Part 2 was covering EQing male and female vocals. In this episode, part 3, we're going to talk about EQing acoustic, electric and bass guitars. And in part 4, we're going to talk about EQing the drums. That's quite a big subject, but I'm going to keep that video short and sweet because I have more videos on that subject. So this 4-part series is the first part of several series covering the basics of mixing. We're going to move on and talk about compression, gates, reverb, delays and buzzers, and how you guys can use them to get yourself started with mixing in your own home studio. Let's get into this video and talk about guitars. So when it comes to guitars, I try and do as little as possible because I am an optimistic believer that the sound a guitar player or a bass player is recording with or producing live is their sound. Now, unfortunately, this isn't always the case. And even if it is the case, given the genre and whatever you're recording, things will need tweaking to get into the mix. So in this video, we're going to talk about some general ideas of how you can treat each instrument to get it sounding good and sitting in your mix as well as possible. These are no means rules, but they are good general suggestions I've found have helped me on my way both live and in the studio, and hopefully they can help you too. So as we discussed in the vocal video, it does help to have an understanding of how your guitars have been recorded to understand how we can mix them and what we need to do. For example, has your guitarist used an amp modulator such as a Kemper, or have they used an actual amplifier? If they've recorded an actual amplifier, brilliant, this is by far my favourite choice. However, what you get out of the amplifier and down the microphones is pretty much what you get. We can EQ this and manipulate it to an extent, but we don't have loads of control unless you want to go into either reamping or modelling an amplified sound, which isn't always the best approach. With Kempers, for example, pros and cons. In my experience, a lot of musicians who use Kempers dial in far too much low end because they're using them with in-ear monitors, which we end up having to take out anyway. However, you can remodel it as much as you want and create whatever sounds you want, and there's some great amp simulator plugins to do that with. Similarly with bass guitars as well, a Mark bass combo versus a Gallion-Kruger sound very different. So stylistically, it's good to be aware of what you've recorded or what your musicians have recorded. So the best thing is, before anything happens, is have a chat with your guys, see what has been recorded, how it's been recorded, or if you're in the studio and you're going to be recording them, discuss with them what sound they want, and then you're going to be ahead of the game already and hopefully won't need to use too much EQ. Let's dive into the computer and start talking about treble frequencies, hotspots, and things we need to bear in mind with the following instruments. Similar principles apply to the guitars as they do to the human voice. For example, 100 to 350 hertz are where the body of the sound is going to be. 250 to 600 hertz is where things could sound a bit honky or a bit boxy and boomy. The sharp, harsh sounds can be found between 1 and 3K. Presence, clarity and attack can be found 3 to 6K. Tinny sounds can be found at the 6 to 10K mark, and anything above K is where you get the air and further presence as well. So in Logic now, we've got one of my songs up called Don't Stop Breathing, and it's got acoustic on, electric and bass, so I thought this would be a good song to talk through. We've got some lovely acoustic guitar playing here by my good friend Sam Wilcock. Let's have a listen to how this sounds. There's a little bit of compression and there's a little bit of reverb just to smoothen the sound out a little bit, but there's no EQ, and we'll talk through what I would do to this guitar. That's a lovely, warm-sounding guitar with enough string definition that gives it some clarity, but it's not overbearing. It's been beautifully played as well. First thing I would do is put on a high-pass filter. Now, if the acoustic is going in a mix with other instruments, I would definitely put this above 100, probably to 100 125, even 150. But as this is the intro of the song and it's on its own, I'm going to put this up to 80. And I've got my classic Logic generic parametric EQ here. More about that in the first video if you missed that. And I'm going to pull this up. Let's listen to the music and we'll pull it up. So anything above 100 and it starts taking away from the warmth of it, and because it is on its own, I want to keep that. So I'm going to keep the low pass filter down there at 82. That sounds good to me. Now acoustics can sound honky in the 250 to 600 hertz range. Let's see if we've got some frequencies here that are going to annoy us in that range. So I've not done much here, just a little bit, just to attenuate some of the honky resonant that's going on at around 500 hertz there. Let's move on up the frequency range just to hear how it sounds. So a little bit of 1K is kind of sounding a little bit nasally to me. And above 5K there was some lovely airy sound, and that's where, you know, anything above 10K is where the presence is. So I'm going to play around with a high shelf here just to see where I feel this sitting, and you can get an idea for how the top end can really help an acoustic stand out in the mix on its own. Obviously it's on its own here, but when you layer stuff up, as with vocals, this will really help the sound stand out. Now these are the frequencies where if the guitar has brand new fresh strings, it can start sounding piercing and really clinky and clicky. These strings are clearly worn in a little bit, but they're not old. If the guitar strings are old, they'll sound very dull, and you'll need to put quite a drastic shelf on, as I'm doing here, to bring out the top end. But these strings sound great, and I don't really need to do too much, but I'm going to leave a little bit in just because I like that presence. So this acoustic really doesn't need much doing to it. Let's move on to the electrics. What you'll notice that I've done here with the electrics, which actually I did with the acoustics, is I'm not processing these microphones individually. I had two microphones on the acoustics, and I've grouped them together onto a bus, and then I've processed both the microphones at the same time on a bus. If you don't know what a bus is for now, don't worry about that. There's going to be a video coming about that later. The same principle applies whether you EQ the channel individually or whether you EQ a group of channels together. With the electrics here, I've got 4 microphones that I had on the guitar cab all grouped together, and I'm processing them all at the same time. This just helps speed things up a little bit with the mixing process, and also enables the group of microphones to sound more like an instrument rather than individual instruments, because we want it to sound cohesive. So we're a bit further down in the song now, and this is a big instrumental section going on. Big guitar chords. Let's talk about how I process electric guitars. Now, similarly with anything except bass and kick drum, I put a high pass filter on to about 100 just to clear up the bottom end. You know, in any room and any guitar amp, the amplifiers make noise and hum, and you know, there's resonances in the room, and there's traffic going by, and not necessarily that these are going to get picked up by a microphone an inch away from a cab, but just to help clear up the mix, a high pass filter is generally a good idea. Let's see how these guitars sound on their own, and then we'll bring in some effects using a parametric similar as we did on the acoustics. So with a high-pass filter, as you heard then, we don't want to go too far because the guitar starts losing its body, its thickness, and there's some really beautiful sounds in that low end. So there's a bit of a resonance there at 230, as we can see there. The 125 to 250 range, or the low mids as they're known as, is where the thickness of the guitar sound is, but it's also where the guitars can sound quite muddy if you've got a lot of layers going on, which I do have in this song. I want to clean those up as much as we can without losing the definition of the guitar. So it's a balancing act. Always make sure you're listening to the rest of the mix in context with the, with the acoustic guitars, the bass, just to hear how everything's sitting. Bit of a honky mid there at about 1K. Let's take a bit of that out. Now this region here, 1K to 3K, is where the guitars can sound harsh. But these guitars recorded by David DeAndrade don't sound harsh. This guy's got an unbelievable guitar sound. So we're not going to need to do much on this track, which is great. So I'm boosting quite a lot there with a high shelf, and clearly Finn, who's recorded this, has probably recorded this without much above 5K going in to the desk, because I'm not hearing certainly anything above 10K. And when I'm boosting 2 to 5K this much, you can start hearing it sounding a little bit fizzy, which I don't like, so I'm definitely going to take that back a little bit. Now, I mentioned Kempers earlier, and a lot of musicians who use Kempers also use molded in-ear monitors. And in my experience live, they have a habit of dialing way too much bottom end, and the guitars will often sound quite muddy like this. At least that's how they often sound to me, so I'll often take a lot of that out. But in this example, I just don't need to do it because it sounds great. Let's move on to the bass guitar. Same thing going on here. I've got 4 microphones that I've grouped onto a bus, a little bit of compression, and I'm just going to go through the EQ, global EQ for all 4 microphones. Now, first thing, obviously we're not putting a high pass on this because it's the bass, so we want all the bass and sub-frequencies. The boomy frequencies can be found at about 125 to 250. Now, those frequencies I find quite can find quite fatiguing individually, depending on the bass. For example, Mark bass amps, in my experience, have loads at these frequencies, and this just blurts out at you. So I often find myself attenuating those. Generally, though, the rest of the frequency spectrum, I try not to take anything away from the bass. I just want the main frequencies at the bottom end just to sit in underneath everything else, and the rest of it is colour and texture, very dependent on how the player plays and the sound they make with their fingers on the instrument. What I do like to do with the bass guitar is to boost about 3K, somewhere between 2 and 4K, just to give it a bit more presence, a little bit more string attack, just to give it some bite and sit in the mix and compete with everything else. Let's try that here. So there we go. 114 is that's honky, so we're going to take a little bit of that out. Let's try 250 as well. A little bit at 250 and a bit about 170 as well. That's more offensive to me, so I'd take that out. Now the rest of it shouldn't really do too much. Bit of a honky sound at 500. Let's take a bit of that out. And some attack. There we go. So it's delicate. I mean, this is Luke Stenner playing bass here, and it sounds great. He's got a great sounding amplifier and bass. So this isn't going to need too much, but you get the idea. 125 to 200 can be honky, 500 can be a bit middly and boxy sounding, attack at 2 to 3k region, and obviously no low pass shelf. A general tip I like to do with the bass is if I'm struggling with the kick, a magic frequency for the bass drum is 80 hertz for that real punch and that, chest thumping punch. So what I'll often do is boost the kick at 80, but take 80 out of the bass guitar to enable the kick to have its space. For example, so as you can see here, I've actually done a cut at 78. Yeah, there's a resonance on the kick bus there that I don't like, but that's fine. What I've done now is a cut at 100 on the bass, but at 100 on the kick there is no cut, so that's enabling those frequencies to pop out a bit more attenuation there just for control, but we're not talking about the kick. So that seems to mix quite nicely with the kick drum. Let's hear it with the guitars. So you can hear there how there's a great separation between all the instruments. You've got the guitars taking up the mids and the tops there, really standing out on their own. You've got the warmth of the bass taking up all the bottom end, still thumpy as well. And you've got the kick drum coming through, snare drum's got its place, the cymbals have got their place above everything, and it all sits quite nicely together. So there's nice separation with everything, and EQ is used to create separation amongst all your instruments. Each one has its place in the frequency range, and ideally we'll have an instrument to cover everything in the frequency range. That's certainly something I aim towards, whether it be a sparkly synth doing the really high end airy stuff, or a sub bass part even to go below the bass guitar. Whatever works. Keep experimenting with EQs, keep using the cue points as you saw me doing as well to find what frequencies were resonating in the room that you recorded the guitars in at the time, or things that you don't like or things that you do like. Just experiment, have fun with it, basically. So there we have it. That's a fundamental breakdown of EQ for acoustics, electrics and bass guitar. Hopefully you've found that helpful. Hopefully you've found value in this video. If you have, please hit subscribe for the next episode, which is going to be covering the EQ on drums, and subsequent episodes are going to be about compression and gates and everything mixing to help you get started with your own projects. Hit the like button if you can, and I will see you on the next one.